everyone, and welcome to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Over the years, we've seen how the rules of the game in our cities, zoning, codes, land use regulations, really help define the content of a community's character. Are there enough different housing options? Are some people being excluded in certain neighborhoods, or, so often these days, pushed out? More and more in hot market cities, planners and political leaders are recognizing how to leverage the rules of the game in land use and housing to make cities more equitable. In this show, we're going to interview one of those leaders from what might be thought of as an unlikely place for the start of revolution. Lisa Bender is a city councilor in Minneapolis, home to the Mall of America, the Minnesota Vikings, and the late rock star Prince, and the Midwestern city that's passed some of the most progressive housing policies and zoning reforms in the country. Under the Minneapolis 2040 plan, the city made some radical change, beginning with a ban on single-family only zoning to promote more multi-family housing in more neighborhoods. Minneapolis also legalized accessory dwelling units, eliminated minimum parking requirements, and dramatically upzoned for more height and density along transit corridors and around employment centers. Perhaps most important, Minneapolis linked all that upzoning with beefed-up affordability requirements, primarily through a policy known as inclusionary housing. This came out of a basic recognition that when local governments change zoning to allow more housing, or local government extends a light rail line into a new neighborhood, those are taxpayer-funded public actions that create tremendous value for private landowners and developers. I caught up with Lisa Bender in Vancouver, Canada, where she teamed up with Lincoln Institute President George Mac McCarthy to help wrap up Railvolution, an annual summit promoting transit and transit-oriented development. Vancouver's confronting a major affordability crisis of its own. Lots of building and a first-rate transit system, but housing that's out of reach for anyone but the wealthy. It's been called the most expensive city in North America. And parts of the Minneapolis game plan might well apply there and in cities across the continent. We talked after one of the conference sessions on the growing wealth gap and what to do about it. So we're here at the Railvolution conference and in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I understand you're just back from a tour of transit-oriented development and especially affordable transit-oriented development, the key being that we don't want to make TOD something, that only rich people can afford. So tell us what you found.
Yeah, so I'm just completed my first 24 hours ever in Vancouver and got to walk around with some planners and transit planners looking at sites and neighborhoods around their transit system. And it's really fascinating to me that so many cities in North America are having a very similar conversation around affordability, how we're growing, a real urgency around climate change and affordability, a real awakening about race equity. But the way that the cities are approaching the solutions are actually very different. And I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way, but it is striking to me to reflect on how just the various strategies that we are all using as we think about how do we leverage development for good.
And the transit system appears to be just fantastic. And so it's following through with the concept of transit-oriented development just perfectly. It's sort of like how all the urban planners envision it. But what about the affordability piece? Did you pick up on anything that seemed promising to ensure affordability beyond perhaps an inclusionary requirement or a certain percentage of below market rate units?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say from what I've heard from folks in Vancouver who've been working here that the city is playing catch up a bit on their affordability strategies and really is experiencing a lot the same trends that many of us are: rising homelessness, just drastic change in their housing market. Prices are rising dramatically. And I think taking a step back and seeing how they can better leverage the market for affordability. Sort of a chicken or egg question. I think Vancouver has clearly done such an amazing job of leveraging development for the public good. And the way they're doing that is, their transit system is better invested than a lot of US cities. We were along a heavy rail line that went out through what are now single family neighborhoods that are being upzoned to multi-story, mixed-use commercial developments with lots of amenities like childcare and theaters and community centers. So they're doing this really thoughtful area planning that's leveraging development for very specific community benefits. But I was struck, so we were in a single-family neighborhood, walking distance from a subway line. And in that neighborhood, the plan says that you can, on a single parcel, go to 4 stories and do condos, ownership housing. In Vancouver, they need to incentivize rental housing because the market is really only building ownership. So you can do a 6-story building that's rental, or you can go up to 18 stories in what is now single family homes today. But if you do that, which you can do on 3 lots, 3 city lots, 50 feet each, you can do an 18-story tower. And if so, you have to include affordable housing, either 30% affordable if you are doing the rest of it ownership, or 20% if you're doing the whole building in rental. So I guess to take it to a bigger picture level, I'm struck by, the really remarkable investment that's being made in transit in this region, which isn't really comparable. There are a few US cities that have a comparable investment in transit, but I think we have a lot more work to do in the US on transit. But then the degree to which they're able to leverage what would be very high intensity development in many US cities to really provide benefit to the community, and really explicitly making that tie between, if we allow this density and this height, we will be able to provide all of these amenities, not just affordable housing, but affordable housing and green space, public spaces, daycare, like a real, true, full community. So it's very obviously very specific and very thoughtful.
No, there's a lot of great leadership here, and I think what everyone is kind of facing down is all this incredible urbanism and infrastructure, and as you say, not have it just be a free-for-all or a windfall for developers and landowners. Now, you also talked about playing catch-up in terms of equity or affordability, and so that makes a pretty good segue to what's going on in Minneapolis. You've been attracting a lot of attention with all the policies and innovation and things you've been talking about there. I want to start with zoning and one policy that attracted a lot of attention, and that was the ban on single-family only zoning. First, I want you to kind of clarify that for, I think the average person might have heard that as no single family, and that's obviously not what Minneapolis is saying, but what you're saying is no single family only zoning. You can't just have a zoning district that is only single family. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. So like a lot of North American cities, our city today has about 60% of the land that's only for single family homes, where you can't have a new duplex or triplex, these very small scale multifamily buildings that were common in US cities and are common as they're grandfathered in a lot of neighborhoods in Minneapolis and other cities across the country. So we said there are no neighborhoods in Minneapolis where you can only have a single family home. You can now, going forward, have up to 3 units on any lot in our city, but for now within the same building envelope that's allowed today. So we're not expanding the size of buildings, but rather what can be done inside them. And I think what we have seen, we made a moderate step toward that. In 2014, we legalized accessory dwelling units, allowing up to 2 units in owner-occupied homes. We've seen most of those as conversions of existing buildings to add another unit. Also very in keeping with the way that our city has evolved over time and really traditional housing patterns in our city. We don't have a lot of row houses or that kind of mid-range dense housing, we could in the future. We haven't traditionally, but we have traditionally had duplexes and triplexes in these smaller multifamily buildings that are detached from each other in our neighborhoods that are on a regular city lot. So it was a big move because it was a philosophical challenge to the idea that there's something better about being in a neighborhood that's only single family homes. We also very explicitly talked about it in the context of race equity and acknowledged our city's history of racial exclusion in housing, knowing that our zoning code, the map that we were looking at in today's zoning code before the change, was the same map as our redlining map, was the same map as where we find racially restrictive covenants that said Black people or Jewish people can't live in these homes, 100 years ago. The city codified that map in its zoning code as well and said these neighborhoods are really only for people who can afford to live in a single family home that can overcome all of these structural barriers in banking to get a mortgage. And that just isn't working for so many people in our community, people of color, but whole generations of people now who are younger than me coming into the workplace. Millennials are now in their late 30s. They have children and families, but that whole generation has come of age in a time where it's very challenging to build wealth, to have ownership, especially in housing. And we just have so many housing needs that aren't just about living in a single family home. So this provides more options for people in every neighborhood. And it's part of a bigger strategy that really looks at how are we developing along transit lines in a more moderate way than Vancouver is. But we took a citywide look. So a lot of cities are really doing this area by area planning and saying, in this area, we're going to allow a lot more development. And when we do, we're going to ask for these specific amenities. And in Minneapolis, we took a citywide look and said, along all of these transit corridors, we're going to allow these bigger buildings, more density, higher buildings near our university, by the riverfront, in our downtown, and around the downtown, where our transit is the most frequent, best service. And that's where we're really continuing to concentrate growth.
So you're focused on changing the rules of the game, especially with regard to zoning or things like accessory dwelling units. How do you sell that? It's a technical matter, and you're kind of untangling or undoing, in a way, things that have been in place for a long time. And of course, for some people, that means scary change because they think maybe, it's been this way for a really long time. What are you doing? Why are you changing? So how is that sort of cultural aspect of what you're doing seem to play out for you?
I mean, that's really the question, is how do we redefine what is normal or the status quo and understand how many people for whom the status quo isn't working today? And, sort of flip that question on its head, I think, when we look forward to the year 2040, which our plan looks out to, and ask the big questions like, who gets to live in our community in the year 2040? What kind of city are our children inheriting? Is it the diverse community that's affordable, that people envision when we ask what people's aspirations are for our city? Have we done the things we need to do that make that a reality? Because that is not the track we are on today. We are on the track of cities that have gone before us that have become unaffordable to working people, where folks are living on the street, in storefronts, and in parks because there's nowhere affordable to live. We already have people working multiple part-time jobs, minimum wage jobs, who can't afford to live in our city. And so we're at a crossroads, both in terms of affordability, but also our impact on the climate. So I think that requires us making some big moves to meet those big aspirations that we hear from my constituents, that we hear from our community. We know we need to make some big moves, but I think we need to do it in a way that's compassionate and understands why people have the fears they do, why people love their community that they live in. And those fears are different, but we find those across the board in our city. We find a lot of fear, rightfully, in low-income communities of color, where government intervention has not led to, successful outcomes in the past. There's a lot of distrust, rightfully, again, and I think we need to earn that trust. If we say we think we have a solution to housing affordability, and it includes affordable housing commitments. And if it has to include a broader strategy that just beyond our zoning code, and we know that, and we're working really hard to put those things in place so that, for example, if the city is making a transit investment, we have an anti-displacement strategy along a transit corridor that is meaningful, that creates wealth for communities of color. And I'm not sure any city has really done that successfully. You can take successful models from around the country, around North America. But I think we have the chance in Minneapolis, because of where we're at with our market, to do it, to learn from other cities and do those things more proactively.
Yeah, you're at a particular time for your city, and it's so interesting. You sort of have San Francisco or Vancouver or New York, and then you have places like Detroit, which, believe it or not, are beginning to think about things like affordability.
Yeah.
And so Minneapolis seems well situated. And it's also encouraging that you feel that you have a sense of a consensus or those aspirations you talked about. So those are the goals, and then you just kind of work back and figure out what mechanical things you need to do. Did you get a lot of pushback, by the way, on accessory dwelling units, or did that sail through pretty reasonably?
There was a lot of concern. The process was relatively quick. We probably spent about 6 months doing community meetings and me talking with my colleagues last term before the most recent election. And I had a number of colleagues that had concerns. We did do this compromise for the home ownership only limitation, which is now removed in the comprehensive plan update. So we did that incremental change. We made those compromises that we needed to get a start and to show people what this could look like, the size that it would be, how it would look in the neighborhoods. And I think it has been successful enough that it helped us build some support for moving to 3 units everywhere. So I think that incremental strategy was successful in Minneapolis.
Yeah, you must really think about that, the pace of change, and incremental versus radical. I imagine in political terms, incremental is probably a little more acceptable for most people. But we'll talk about the politics in a moment. I want to turn now to the policies that are supporting more affordability, increased affordability requirements, inclusionary housing. And could you talk a little bit about how, you talked about leveraging these incredible development opportunities. Is it not the case that when you upzone, you're prompting this incredible increase in value for land and property, and so you feel like you're in a pretty good position to strengthen the affordability requirements, like, for example, through inclusionary housing. So inclusionary housing in Minneapolis, I believe it's on the track where it's 15% as a baseline?
No, so we have an interim ordinance now that we adopted along with the comprehensive plan when we voted last December in 2018 to adopt the plan. We've been waiting for our regional government to approve it. So the plan will come back to council for final approval this November 2019. And then our final inclusionary zoning ordinance will be ready to go in December, in the next council cycle after our plan is approved. Right now, where we're headed is a 10% requirement for most projects. We are working on that, what will be the lower limit of how many units the policy will apply to. And then if we have things like an in lieu fee, or if we're requiring all of those units on site. So developers will have the option to provide 10% at 60% area median income, or if they choose to do 20% at 50% area median income, they'll be eligible for city funding to help close the rent gaps. And there'll be an application process. The intention isn't to subsidize the development, but rather help close the gap. So that would, again, so there'll be TIF funding. We're using TIF as the financing tool, but you could use other funding sources. So to help get more and deeper affordability. Our inclusionary zoning conversation is in the context in Minneapolis, and all cities have inherited where they're at today. And where Minneapolis is at today is our downtown zoning has been very permissive in terms of building size, height, and density since before I was born, since the 1960s. And so when I came into office in 2014, our downtown had allowed for many decades development with no affordable housing requirements as of right.
Nobody had to do anything.
Right. And so for us, we had two options in that scenario. We could either make affordable housing requirements essentially mandatory, tied to a relatively common development application, or we could downzone downtown 50 years after it was zoned for development and try to sort of reset the bar for what's the base zoning. But the latter seemed just so counterintuitive to the direction that we've been going for 50 years and just sort of the expectations of our market. And so we've gotten ourselves to a position based on past decisions in downtown, but also other parts of the city that were very quickly growing, industrial land that was redeveloped. All of that was done with no affordability requirements. And so now we're coming in 2019, I think at least 10 years too late, probably 40 years too late, and saying, how can we reset this and get some affordability requirements into our market that is used to building housing with no, unless it's a city-owned project or it has city funding, then it has to have affordability requirements in it. But our market isn't used to providing affordable housing or even fees. So this is our first inclusionary zoning ordinance that will apply to market rate development. We're getting huge pushback from our development community that says, we're going to kill all the development. No one will ever build again. I think they're overstating that. I think that this is the chicken and egg thing I referred to earlier. A lot of the cities that are being very aggressive on affordable housing have very high rents that support leveraging the market in a way that cities with more moderate rents like Minneapolis, or even like look at Detroit, or weak markets. So how do those of us who have weak markets in our cities, whether the whole city or parts, leverage the market in a way that actually allows the market to grow? Because inclusionary zoning relies on the market providing units, or it doesn't work as a strategy, and so, but then also taking a step back and realizing that if we're talking about avoiding homelessness or helping homeless families get into housing, our 10% inclusionary zoning policy is really not the strategy that we're talking about to achieve those goals. It's like a drop in the bucket. It's a way to leverage some of the financial increase in land value that people are seeing as we're investing in transit, investing in parks, eliminating parking requirements, changing our zoning to make it much easier to develop. It's a small, I would consider, give back to the public and the public good. But I think we're all trying to strike that right balance. And Vancouver, again, as a contrast, is really doing it in an area planning way, allowing for significantly higher development, going from single family zoning to 18 stories and leveraging that market change to get all kinds of public benefits. In Minneapolis, we're taking more of a citywide view. We have a park dedication fee, this new affordable housing requirement, and saying, how can we leverage all of this development citywide and then reinvest citywide?
But it sounds somewhat modest, really, it's in the context of your housing markets, and, they vary so much region to region, but it sounds modest and quite reasonable. So how was that by design, or did you just look at all the different things you needed to do to try to bring about more inclusive affordability?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that this city council would not have supported the policy changes that are making it easier to develop without an affordability requirement baked in. And that's really part of the commitment we've made to say we really are serious about growing in an equitable way. And yes, a 10% affordability requirement is the very least we can do. And I think we'll have to see. We'll have to see how our market adjusts. I know it will adjust and have to adjust, but I think that our policy will work to produce units. I'm anxious to get it in place before this economic downturn that we've been hearing is coming. We've missed here some good years of economic growth. Again, if we would have had a policy in place, we would have gotten hundreds of units of affordable housing built through an inclusionary zoning policy. So I think it is a good tool for cities to use, as long as we acknowledge that it's getting us housing for working people, for people who are still making pretty high incomes. It's not getting us, subsidized housing for the lowest income folks in our communities. And sometimes that's just a conversation that we have to have with our constituents, because our constituents think 10% of units at 60% AMI, which is pretty high and pretty still available in our market, doesn't sound like such a great deal. They're watching their neighbors and themselves facing higher rents, facing eviction, facing, displacement because of rent increases with very little protection for renters under our state laws. And they feel like it's not such a great deal.
Are there other policies and approaches that can chip away at the problem? For example, community land trusts. That would be one approach. Is that catching on at all in Minneapolis?
Yeah, we have a great land bank, community land bank. I think this is an underutilized strategy for us. And especially in the places where we are making public investment. My colleagues and I are really talking about using this strategy more. Cooperative housing, a number of colleagues, actually both cooperative housing and cooperative commercial. And so I think we have some parts of our city that are still are not seeing market rate development. They're not recovered, or they're in weaker market areas of our city. And some of my colleagues are doing really exciting work, who just took office, a year ago or so, to really lay the groundwork for what I think could be some of the best truly integrated economic development and, wealth building policy that we've seen. And I think, again, we are learning from other cities. We have the benefit of time, but we don't have a lot of time. And so for us, if we can shift the land ownership in our city to public ownership or to ownership in communities of color, that will be a game changer for our community. Because if we talk about subsidizing rents or commercial rents or residential rents, that money still isn't staying in the community. It's a Band-Aid for some families that are able to get into subsidized housing, but it isn't creating wealth in communities of color. It isn't, reversing this access to financial opportunity that we have seen that is creating these huge wealth gaps in our communities based on race. So we talk a lot about housing, but as housing costs go up, income is falling in communities of color. And so if we don't address that income piece, especially talking about race equity in housing, we're just really putting on little Band-Aids as we go along. And so I think really getting into that ownership side is critical.
Now, what is it about Minneapolis that has made it so attractive? You're looking at kind of a boom, right? Or the past several years. Light rail seems to have had a lot to do with it. A return to downtown by various demographic groups. The business community seems to be thriving. But what is it about Minneapolis that suddenly made it a hot city?
Yeah, it's a beautiful city. I love it there. We have the river. We have a great, it's a place where you really can settle into a neighborhood and find community. However you define that, we have a really strong network of immigrant communities among population, small American population, that have now been in our community for, decades, that have really created cultural institutions and support systems. So kind of no matter where you're at in the economic spectrum or how long you've lived in the city, I think it is a place where you can really find community. We have a job, we have great, amazing employment opportunities in the region. Like in every other measure, we have a race problem in the job market. And we have both a job shortage. We don't have enough workers we have a worker shortage. We don't have enough workers for the jobs that are available, but we also have much higher unemployment in our communities of color than in our white population. And so we have a mismatch of skills and opportunities among the people who live in our community today. And people are moving because it's easy to find a good job. Our housing is still relatively affordable compared to other cities. And yeah, we are investing in the amenities like transit and bike infrastructure and parks that people want to see and want to live in. We have great schools. But that all that adds up to saying we need to make sure that as we grow and as more people move in because of these amenities and our investments we are making, that it is not displacing more people. And we are starting to see that. That is what we are seeing is more displacement from city neighborhoods, more poverty moving into the suburbs, which are not as well served by transit, where transportation costs are higher. The inner ring suburbs are also seeing residential displacement. Across the state, or urban areas are really suffering, again, with state laws that don't protect renters, even in what I think most people would consider a basic fairness test. We have some of the most, I think it's fair to say we have some of the worst state laws in the country for renter protections. So we need some leadership at the state, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there for some low-hanging fruit that would just say, if you're going to get evicted from your apartment, you deserve a written notification. Because today in Minnesota, if you're 1 day late on your rent, your landlord can file eviction the next day with no notice to you. And that eviction filing stays on your record indefinitely under state law. Landlords, it stays on your record for 7 years. We're about to pass a local law that says landlords can't look back more than 2 years on your eviction history. But it will be challenging to enforce given all the other factors. So I think, going upstream and making sure that we're protecting renters so that they can stay in their existing homes. We're working to preserve affordability in the market, participating in the market as a buyer along with nonprofit partners. We're working to incentivize landlords to keep their rents lower. And we are also leveraging our regulatory tools as a city, I think, in a way that I think is really ripe for a lot of good results. So we actually license every single rental property in the city. So even a duplex, or if you own a single family home and rent out a unit, you have to have a rental license for that rental unit. And so we have a lot of leverage using our rental licensing authority to incentivize the things we want to see. A colleague and I, Councilmember Jeremiah Ellison, who was here speaking at Revolution earlier, authored a Renters First policy that directs the Regulatory Services Department to really prioritize the people who are living in buildings as their highest priority when they're looking at a regulatory framework for rental housing. So how can we use our regulatory tools to keep people in their homes instead of inadvertently causing evictions or displacement through our regulatory enforcement? So I think we're going to see success with that in Minneapolis over the years as we sort of dig into how are we using inspections. We're starting to do tenant remedy actions on behalf of tenants who are living in properties where their landlords aren't making basic repairs for the first time in a decade or two. So I think we're providing legal funding for legal protection for renters in the court system. A lot of cities have had good results. New York City passed a right to counsel. Cleveland, Ohio is looking at a right to counsel ordinance that would say any low-income renter in housing court gets to have a lawyer provided for them by the community, the city, or nonprofit partners. And in New York City, when they passed that commitment, eviction filings fell by something like 30% because landlords have been using our housing court systems as a bill collection agency for tenants, low-income tenants who have no protection, no lawyers, no way to really fight back. And so I think all these things will help us go upstream. And I think, when we think about, again, if we look out to 2040 or even 5 or 10 years from now, things that might have seemed radical or very regulatory, very heavy-handed, I think are becoming more mainstream because people are in such a crisis. And we see if our two choices are to have some better protections for renters or having people living in our parks and on our streets and in our public spaces because they have nowhere else to go, I think people are starting to see that giving some people more protection is the right choice.
Well, it's really quite a dashboard from rentals to home ownership. So many pieces of the puzzle that you are working on. So congratulations. Lisa Bender, City Council, Minneapolis, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Well, that's it for this episode of Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flynn, and thanks for listening. We're finding answers in land.